I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 effectively meant the end of slavery, but African Americans were in for a long struggle before they were finally awarded equal rights. As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged to by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses, in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. Soon broadened to include schools, many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes. By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests. These included 1955's Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. A watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students, nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence. The Southern Freedom Movement continued into the 60s, with support from newly elected President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The violence of the Birmingham, Alabama campaign influenced the president to fully endorse the movement.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
On June 19, 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to look at one of the most important periods of American social history, the 1950s. Why is it so important? Well, first, because it saw the advent of the greatest invention in human history. Television.
Mr. Green, I like TV. By the way, you're from the future. How does the X-Files end? Are there aliens or no aliens?
No spoilers, me from the past. You're gonna have to go to college and watch the X-Files get terrible just like I did. No, it's mostly important because of the civil rights movement. We're gonna talk about some of the heroic figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but much of the real story is about the thousands of people you've never heard of who fought to make America more inclusive. But before we look at the various changes that the civil rights movement was pushing for, we should spend a little time looking at the society that they were trying to change. The 1950s has been called a period of consensus, and I suppose it was, at least for the white males who wrote about it, and who all agreed that the 1950s were fantastic for white males. Consensus culture was caused first by the Cold War. People were hesitant to criticize the United States for fear of being branded a communist, and second by affluence. Increasing prosperity meant that more people didn't have as much to be critical of. And this widespread affluence was something new in the United States. Between 1946 and 1960, Americans experienced a period of economic expansion that saw standards of living rise and gross national product more than double. And unlike many previous American economic expansions, expansions, much of the growing prosperity in the 50s was shared by ordinary working people who saw their wages rise. To quote our old friend Eric Foner, by 1960, an estimated 60% of Americans enjoyed what the government defined as a middle-class standard of living. And this meant that an increasing number of Americans had access to things like television and air conditioning and dishwashers and air travel. That doesn't really seem like a bonus. Anyway, despite the fact that they were being stuffed into tiny metal cylinders and hurtled through the air, most Americans were happy because they had, like, indoor plumbing and electricity. The 1950s was the era of suburbanization. The number of homes in the United States doubled during the decade, which had the pleasant side effect of creating lots of construction jobs. The classic example of suburbanization was Levittown in New York, where 10,000 almost identical homes were built and became home to 40,000 people almost overnight. And living further from the city meant that more Americans needed cars, which was good news for Detroit, where cars were being churned out with the expectation that Americans would replace them every 2 years. By 1960, 80% of Americans owned at least one car, and 14% had two or more. And car culture changed the way that Americans lived and shopped. I mean, it gave us shopping malls and drive-through restaurants and the backseat makeout session. I mean, high school me didn't get the backseat makeout session, but other people did. I did get the Burger King drive-through, though. And lots of it. Our whole picture of the American standard of living, with its abundance of consumer goods and plentiful services, was established in the